Hey everyone, this is Amanda, and not Rita today because Rita took a much-deserved vacation to her hometown, which she hadn't been to in many years, and it is Mother's Day weekend, so we decided to let her off the hook. So instead, today I am joined with a special guest. I am here today with Mary Cronk Farrell. Mary is the author of 8 books, I believe. Is that correct? Centered on the stories of women in history whose names haven't been known well enough or perhaps have been forgotten over time, which makes her a perfect guest for I Don't Know Her, the podcast about women you've probably never heard of, but you should have. Mary has won a number of awards and honors for her writing, including the Eureka Children's Book Award for Excellence in Nonfiction, nominations for the Washington State Book Award, the Spur Award for Best Juvenile Fiction about the American West, and her books have been featured on a number of lists, including the New York Public Library's Best Book for Teens. And I thought this was personally fascinating. Prior to being an author, Mary worked as a TV news journalist, garnering 2 Emmy nominations. And we are very honored to have you here. So welcome, Mary. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I am very honored, Amanda, to be here.
Well, I really can't stress enough how exciting it is to have an author of your stature come talk to us about your work and also about these women's stories.
Well, I love to talk about these women. You might have to cut me off at some point.
You know what? I would love to have extra material. We'll put it up as a bonus episode for our Patreon subscribers. So I wanted to start off with talking a little bit about your mission. I was reading your website and I was struck by how close what you said, like the reason you write about these stories, it's so close to what we do and why we do it. So I'd love for you to share with our audience a little bit about why you write the kinds of books you do.
Mostly, I guess I would say I write them because I have to. Most of these women that I've written about, I have stumbled across on the internet, and I have thought, why have I never heard of this woman before or these women? And I think it's so important. We're missing so much of history because we do not have women's voices and other marginalized voices. And I think that I think we have a lot we can learn from women of the past. There are women who have been through incredible hardship and have prevailed, and I just think that we have a lot of the same issues, unfortunately, today that they have faced. It's like these issues have not gone away.
And hardly even changed sometimes.
Yeah, that's sad, but true.
Yeah, I've found that to be true in our research too, is that like the closer I get to some of the stories, I'm like, why is this still the same? Why haven't we been able to conquer this problem that this woman set out to conquer 50, 100 years ago? It's an incredible, I think for me, it's like that idea that history repeats itself being so real in a way that I really wish wasn't true.
Right. Well, and that's one of the reasons I write for kids is because I personally think that history is such a key to, you can't understand where you are unless you know where you've come from. And history is such a key to making decisions about how to move forward in the future. There's so much wisdom in the history, in the past, in women's lives. And I think that young people possibly are more open to being exposed to new things that they haven't seen and heard before.
Yeah, that was actually the next thing I was going to ask you about was writing for children and young adults. What made you decide to do that besides the wanting to teach history? What drew you to that audience and that specific writing style? Because it is a little different than writing for adults.
It is. I think probably 2 main things. And the first is that when I was a teen and a preteen, books were so important to me and such a huge part of my life. not just for fun. I mean, they offered something that I couldn't get anywhere else. This idea that I could read a book and think, okay, there is someone else who feels like I do.
Yes.
There is someone else who thinks these thoughts that I think. I'm not alone. And then I wrote for adults for a number of years, but what I believe about kids is, first of all, they demand the truth. And they know when they hear it, whether it's the truth. And they are also, like a lot of people might tend to think that kids' books are not as well written as adult books. And that is so far from the truth.
Agreed.
Because for one reason, to keep a kid's attention with all the other options that they have, you need to really pull them in and tell them something that they find valuable, interesting, whatever it is. So they're just a tough customer. And I guess I feel like that I'm doing really quality work for individuals, teens that will really take seriously what they read and be open to what they read.
I think there's also, I was reading a biography of Fanny Brice, who I talked about a couple of weeks ago on the show, and the biography was written by an adult man, and it was awful. I hated that book. And I think a lot of it has to do with filler. I mean, it was just, if I wanted a playbill for every single performance that woman did in her life, I would seek that out. But what I want in a biography is a story.
Right.
And it was like, you do not have an editor, do you? And you could never get away with that in young adult lit, because they will just put that book right away. It'll just go on the shelf and it'll never get read, because you need to keep their attention. You need to be able to tell a story and not get bogged down in the details and pump it full of filler, which is what that felt like.
And I think and you would know this more than me even, it needs to be relevant. It really needs to be relevant. And so with history, you might think that's a double job, making history relevant. But I guess that's what I love doing.
Awesome. I applaud that, because I personally, as a history podcast, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is make history accessible and feel relevant to today. One of the questions that we get asked a lot, and you kind of touched on it, but I'd like to hear more about it. We get asked all the time about how we come up with the women that we talk about on the show. So I want to throw that back at you, because I'm very excited to hear what somebody else has to say about how do you decide who to talk about.
Well, besides the books I've written about women, I also have a blog and a newsletter that I write. And I write about women every week in my newsletter and on my blog. And these are women that I'd love to write books about if I could write 100 books a day. But the one thing that continually amazes me is I've been writing my blog now for over 10 years. And I thought early on, and I think practically every month since then, that I will run out of women that have great stories.
Yeah.
I just can't even believe how I keep finding them. So I guess with the internet, everything is all the information, it's so accessible. And most of these women that I have not gone seeking out any of them. I have discovered them while looking for something else. And I do notice over recently that the internet, that there has been a change in the type of information that you find. I find that I have to dig a lot more because when I stumble across a woman, a lot of the information will just be cut and pasted from
repetitive
10 other sources.
Oh, I know.
And so it's a little harder work than it used to be to actually write, find the facts to write the story. But I also have discovered a few in the library, just in the biography section of the library.
I actually, I know as a librarian and a writer, I probably shouldn't love it, but I love archive.org. I don't know if you know about Archive, but it is this free internet library where they, people take like books that have been deleted from a library and they scan them and put them online. And I know that there's lots of issues with that in terms of artists getting their pay and their due. But there are lots of books that are just no longer in print. You couldn't get them if you wanted to. You couldn't pay that artist if you wanted to. And I found some really cool collective biographies and found women's names in the table of contents that I'm like, this is amazing. My list from one book alone, my list went from, I have like a list of like 170 women I want to talk about on the show. And it went from 170 to like 200 from one book because there were so many women in this one book that had never come across my table before. So if you haven't done that, I would recommend it because it's great. And I also then will find whole biographies on those women sometimes on archive.org that were written, 60 years ago, and I'll read the whole thing, and it's online, and it's great, but it also obviously...
Well, actually, I got referred to that just yesterday or the day before. My piece that I wrote most recently was about a female, but it was about a female horse. And this was a horse named Reckless that served with the Marines in the Korean War.
Oh, wow.
And so apparently a book was written about her back in the 50s, right after the war. And so I clicked on the link and it did. It took me right to that archives and I was like, what's this?
I know. Isn't it great though? I mean, I love the idea of being able to access stuff that otherwise we would not have access to. Even if I walked into the public library, I wouldn't have been able to access it because it's no longer there.
Right.
So I love the way that the internet sort of equalizes access to information, especially for something like our show and what we do here. And then we regurgitate it to people who don't have the time to read an entire biography on archive.org.
Save people time.
So, we're talking about your writing. I'd actually like to pivot and talk about one of the women that you've written about is actually somebody that we spoke about on our first season. I have been fascinated with this woman for years, and that's Irena Sendler. What was the name of that book that you did about her?
It's called Irena's Children.
Yes, Irena's Children. And it's an adaptation, right?
Right. So so I adapted that book from the adult manuscript, and I had written about her on my blog like 6 months before this project came along. So as soon as this project came along, I was like, oh, I know all about her.
Yes. And I had known about her from teaching the Holocaust to 8th grade English students. So I had decided early on that in the first season I wanted to cover her story. And so we did, I think it was episode 17 that I talked about Irena. And what drew you initially when you decided to write about her on your blog? What drew you to Irena's story?
Irena, I don't know if she might be one in a billion people in what she did. What drew me was that she risked her life every single day, practically. I mean, I don't know how many days a week she went into the Warsaw Ghetto, got past those Nazi guards.
Yep.
But it was, I mean, I can't even talk about her. She basically was willing to put her life on the line. And initially it was to bring medicine and food.
Yes, yeah. She was bringing supplies and food. She was working at the time, am I right? She was like a city worker, right?
Correct.
And it was, she became part of the resistance, the underground resistance, and was bringing in supplies along with a couple other women, right?
Right. Actually, she had quite a network of many women and men. It's attributed to her that she saved something like 2,500 children. But she certainly had a lot of help. And her network was part of her genius. I mean, there's so many things about Irena. And it's coincidentally, I just watched The Zookeeper's Wife last night. And so it brought all that back to me. That was the woman who hid Jews in the Warsaw Zoo with her husband. And Irena actually was hidden in there for a time.
I did not know that.
Yeah, so it's not in the movie, and I don't know if it's in the book, but she was. And that was after she was arrested and free. I mean, besides Irena's amazing selflessness, the story is just too incredible for words, that she would be captured.
Yes.
And tortured, basically. I mean, not basically, she was tortured.
Yeah, didn't she have I'm trying to remember, it's been 3 years since I did that. Didn't she have a permanent injury?
She did. I forget if they beat her legs.
Yeah.
I think she was beaten on her legs, and then her job, at least at one point in the prison, was to wash sheets or clothing. I don't know what she was washing, but she was standing over a sink on a broken leg.
Yeah.
Working probably all hours of the day. And so she did have a permanent injury. But the fact that she then never revealed names under torture. I can't even imagine that. I'd be, okay, I'll tell you everything.
I know.
As they slapped my hand. I can't take pain. But she then, it's on the day when she is going to her execution that she is rescued at the very last minute. Her followers had bribed
the guards, right?
A Nazi guard. So when they would open, she was in this waiting room with the other women who were being shot that day, and they would open the door and call your name, and you would walk out. And when it was her turn, a different door opened on the other side of the room, and they called her name, and she walked out, and she didn't even understand what was going on, and the guard just kind of just shoved her and said, "Get out of here, get out of here."
Oh my God. I don't think I ever knew that part of it.
She couldn't, at that point, she was starving, and she was so injured, she could hardly walk.
Yeah.
She was in terrible physical condition and a mental condition too. I mean, that kind of, not getting proper nutrition plus torture, I mean, that can do a lot of crazy things to your mind. So, but she made her way to a corner drugstore, and thank God the people there took her in. So talk about a story. I mean, on the one hand, there's me who admires someone who's selfless and brave, and on the other hand, there's me who's a storyteller.
Yeah.
And it's better than fiction.
Yeah.
You could not make this up.
Yeah, I love her story for those same reasons. I will say that in my research, I did discover something that I thought was actually really interesting. And so I want to ask you about how you talk about the complexity of people, because one of the things I discovered was that she was this hero to so many people and saved all of these children, like you talked about, 2,500 children. But she, to her own children, was very cold and distant and aloof, and they just never really thought of her as a good mother. And I thought, wow, like that's something you wouldn't expect from this person that you are, seeing as this like selfless hero. And I find that sometimes I want to gloss over those parts of the person's life that I'm talking about, and because I'm like worried that it'll tarnish their reputation or in some way diminish their achievements or impact. But at the same time, one of the things that we seek to do on the show is portray women as complex. I think we have this tendency to martyr women, and in doing so, we take away their complexity. If Irena is only a hero, then how would I ever be able to connect or, find a way that she's also human? So how do you do that in your writing? How do you tackle that kind of complexity?
Well, I think that is an excellent point to discuss, because luckily with children's literature, just even in the last 10, 15, definitely in the years, the body of work that's being published in nonfiction has moved dramatically to where we can tell the truth about people.
Yeah.
And I think that is definitely necessary and essential, because you are perfectly right. One of the things that when I talk about the women in my books, that it always comes down to is these women were not special people. Mm-hmm. These were ordinary people. I mean, I just got done saying Irena was special, but it's like, it's minute to minute how you react and engage with what's happening around you. And none of these women were born courageous and selfless.
Right.
They were called to it in the moment. But back to the idea of them not being perfect. None of us are perfect. And we cannot, if we think these wonderful women were perfect, we cannot aspire to be like them. Yes,
I think that's one of the things I come across, is that when you put someone on a pedestal, that is a barrier. It means that person is not attainable. I can't be as good as that person. And I don't think that's what they would have wanted.
No. Well, and to make this very personal, okay, my name is Mary, and I grew up Roman Catholic, and the Virgin Mary was held up to me as the ideal woman. And that right there,
Come on, Mary, you weren't an impregnated virginal goddess?
That was something to grow out of. I mean, I like, that's another day's topic, but I think it's a perfect example of what you're talking about. And the other thing that I have known and discovered in researching women is that often, actually, women who have done a lot for others or for a cause do not tend to be good mothers.
Yeah, I'm finding that to be true in a lot of my research.
Dorothy Day is a perfect example of that. Now she is one who's being canonized, I think. Well, maybe not as a saint, but she was not a good mother. And number one, I don't really even think, I mean, there are a lot of people who aren't good mothers who don't do anything that we can look to and aspire to. But also, there is a cost.
Yes.
To some causes. There are directions that a woman may choose in her life, and there may be a huge cost to that. Yeah. And one of them, I'll just bring up Catherine Leroy, who is the subject of my next book. She was a photographer during the Vietnam War, and she was a war photographer for 20, 25 years. She never married. She never had a family. And because of the type of work she chose to do, those types of things just didn't fit into her life.
Yeah.
So I think it's very complex, and the whole idea of what a good mother is another woman's issue that we could talk forever about.
We end up talking a lot about mothering and motherhood on our show. I was a foster mother. My co-host is a mother of a now almost teen boy, which is wild. And then I am estranged from my own mother, and so is her husband. Her husband's estranged from his mother, and then she has a pretty complex relationship with her mother. So we end up talking a lot about mothering and motherhood and the expectations of women versus the expectations of men and fatherhood, because we often don't have these kinds of conversations that we're having right now. Who cares if Sugihara was a good father? He saved a lot of people's lives.
Right. No one's looking at these men from history and saying, oh, well, they weren't a good father.
Yeah, clearly Thomas Jefferson sucked ass at being a father, but nobody talks about that.
Oh, and here's a sad thing, because you're a different generation than me. I'm going to say it right out. I'm over 60. And what is so painful to me is that some of these issues about men and women have not changed. I mean, when I was a young woman, the big question was, could you be a mother and have a job? Could you do both?
Yeah.
And now a lot of women have jobs and children, but there's an underlying structure of culture and thought that is still stuck on how that should work out and what that means. And I'm not even finding words for it. But the fact that in the year 2021,
the pandemic destroyed women's careers.
Right.
Because it became the job of the woman in a heterosexual cis pairing to stay home and take care of those children despite her career. And that saddened me greatly. I no longer identify as a woman, but obviously I was raised in a culture, in a society that sees me as a woman. And of course, there's a lot of my story that's wrapped up in womanhood. I found it so hard to see all of these think pieces being written about the amount of women who have just permanently left the workforce. Like, that feels like a huge step back.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I feel like we're having that similar thing that happened during World War II when all the men were away and all the women got great jobs. And then the men came back and all the women lost those jobs. Well,
the other thing too is that so many of the women who had to work, I'm not just talking about nurses and doctors on the front lines in that way. I'm talking about people in service jobs that were required to go to work, and how many of them were low-paid women. And it's the same whenever you talk about women and job. Women have always worked, and poor women have always worked outside the home. I mean, many of them have worked. So, yeah, the issue is very complex, but the people, the women who have had to work through this pandemic in low-paying jobs where they worked with the public have really really suffered.
I mean, and they carried the
unfairly.
nation on their backs.
Right.
And that's unfair. My co-host is one of them. Works as a server and at one of the few restaurants that stayed very busy the entire time because they were a great takeout option. And when they decided to quote unquote cut the fat and keep just essential personnel working in their restaurant, that included her. And so she was just working constantly and her child was at home. It was hard. I mean, luckily she has a very supportive spouse, but not everybody does. So we kind of went off the tracks a little bit. I actually do want to talk about your newest book. Tell me how to say her name again.
Well, I have been practicing this, and I don't know if I have it right yet because I do not speak French.
Oh my God, I'm so bad at it.
I do not speak French.
Have you ever listened to any of our episodes where I talk about a French person?
No.
Don't. It's such an embarrassment.
Well, I have been practicing this now. For the longest time, when I was researching and writing, I wasn't even worried about how to say her name.
Yeah, Catherine Leroy.
Yes, right. Catherine Leroy. But
it didn't even occur to me that her name was not pronounced Catherine Leroy until you said it. And I was like, I thought you were talking about the next book beyond this one. And I was like, oh, I wonder who that is. And then as soon as you talked about Vietnam photojournalist, I was like, oh, I do not know how to say this person's name.
So I'm probably not the one to learn how to say it, but I was on a panel last week where there were other people who knew Catherine or wrote about Catherine. So I was listening very carefully. And it seems to me that the way they say her name is Catherine Leroy.
Catherine Leroy. Okay, I'm going to do my best. So that's one of my next questions is actually about your next book, which comes out in February, right?
Correct.
February of 2022. It's called Close Up on War. That's a final title, I assume?
Yes.
So you talk about the French photojournalist Catherine Leroy, yay, who I thought took some of the most incredible photos of the Vietnam War and like literally in the action of it. They were featured in Time, Look, Life magazine, the New York Times, but her name kind of fell off the radar, as you talked about in your book. Why do you think people forgot about Catherine Leroy?
Because she was a woman. The short answer. Like I said, she worked on the front lines of combat for at least 20 years. And when she decided she'd had enough, and moved over to the civilian side.
Yeah.
She couldn't get jobs.
She couldn't get a job like just taking photos?
Right. I mean, she could have maybe taken portraits of Hollywood stars or something like that, but she could not get assignments to take news photographs.
Yeah.
Thank you. She did not get assignments. Men got assignments and she did not. She could not. This is so sad, but she basically, this is a sad story. She could not get assignments. She could barely support herself.
Really? I always wonder about that when we talk about some of the people we talk about, because we'll have all of this information about the time in which they're active and then very little information about when they're inactive. And I always wonder what happens in that inactive time. Are they, just working as a grocery store like clerk? Are they doing what they love? Like, I don't know, because we just don't get to know that information.
One of the things about Catherine was that she loved fashion. And that's one of the fun things about my book that I think teens will relate to, is she's like talking about, the
dresses,
the bullets, and then she's saying, "Mom, send me my blue silk dress."
Yeah, and my bikini.
Yeah. But so near the end of her life, she died of cancer, probably from smoking all those years. I don't know, or maybe from effects of Vietnam.
Yeah. I would say that maybe both, or I would say that all that time she spent in Vietnam can't have been good.
Right. No, definitely. And she had a business. She was trying to make money selling high-end purses and clothing,
I see.
Like getting them from France and selling them. One thing she did that after her combat career was she went and did some photo shoots in Japan, fashion photo shoots, the amazing fashion photo shoots in Japan.
I would have loved to see that.
Yeah, you'll have to Google that. And here's another thing she did. One comment that she made somewhere along the way was that one of her favorite stories that she did for the news was about the Mohawk men who were the iron workers that built the buildings in the 60s in like New York and Chicago. And she photographed them, and that was one of her favorite assignments.
So we've talked a little bit about her, but on the show, normally what we do is we tell a person's story from like start to finish. And I know obviously you don't want to tell her entire story because that's what your book is about. But tell us a little bit about her story. Who was she? When was she born? What did she do? So that our listeners have an idea of what it is you were writing about with Katrine.
Well, a very interesting thing is that she was French, and she was born in 1945 in France when the Allies were bombing France. There was a huge bombing raid near where her parents lived on the night she was born.
Wow. So she was like meant for war.
Yeah, I guess so. And she was sick as a child, and she was tiny. I mean, she was very tiny even as an adult.
I know, 4'9", 4'10"?
Well,
she was under 5 feet, wasn't she?
Well, her thing was in her combat boots, she was 5 foot and weighed 100 pounds with all her combat gear and boots. So she was a couple inches under 5 foot, at least an inch, and very tiny young
she looked
woman.
Very tiny.
So she was a tiny child, and she had some kind of respiratory illness. And back then, they would send children to the Swiss Alps for the Swiss Alps were the place where people went with consumption.
Yes.
Because the air, so she as a child got sent off by herself several times to stay for months in the Swiss Alps away from her parents. She was an only child. Well, she had a step brother, I think, that was much, much older. But so she started out kind of at a disadvantage, and then she was attracted to photography in her like preteens. And then she liked to say, I was a bad element. I got kicked out of 6 schools in 6 years. So
I love a good rebel.
Yeah. And so she like, I don't really know their school system over there, but if it were here, you'd say she didn't graduate from high school. She dropped out and started just trying to do different things. At one point, she was trying to start a parachuting. What do you call parachuting?
Skydiving.
A skydiving school or something. She learned to skydive because she was dating a guy who was a skydiver, and she wanted to impress him. So she actually became an excellent. She had 80 when she went to Vietnam. She had 84 skydives, and I forget, maybe half of them were the dives where you're free falling for long distance before your chute even opens. And so one of the things that happened was that Catherine was included in the one and only parachute drop in the Vietnam War.
Yeah, that's a very exciting scene in the book, when she jumps out of the plane with these soldiers and they're being shot at as they're coming down in the air. That's an incredibly tense scene.
And there were rumors that she slept with someone to get to do that. That is so untrue. No, she was the only photographer, except for Army photographers, who made that jump. And she was more well qualified. She had more jumps than the soldiers, some of them, that were jumping. And yet her success had to be torn down.
It had to be diminished because, a woman could never be more qualified. That would just be absurd, right?
Yeah.
It felt very much like personal jealousy, like professional jealousy, mixed in with a whole lot of misogyny.
Well, what's really, I guess it's just to be accepted. But of course, when she went to Vietnam, she came up against the American military misogyny.
Yes.
But then the News Corps turned on her. That is what is really sad.
When did that happen? And what was the reason for that? Actually, we should probably back up. So how old is she when she does the skydiving stuff. She drops out of school. She does the skydiving. And then how does she become a war journalist?
Okay, so, yeah.
Like, I guess, what year did she go to Vietnam? Was it 65?
66.
66. So she's 21.
She's 21.
Okay.
So she decided that she wanted to be a combat photographer. She had read this French news pictorial magazine as a young person, and there were photographs of the French fighting in Vietnam, and all other photographs that really caught her attention. And so she decided she wanted to become a photographer, and she said the biggest story was Vietnam. So she started working a job that she hated as a clerical type job, and just saved all her money to buy a camera and a plane ticket.
And then she just went.
She had
it's wild.
Like $200 in her pocket, and she flew to Vietnam. She landed first in Laos, and there she started practicing with the camera.
Yeah, she'd never really taken photos.
No, she hadn't. She learned on the job. And what's incredible is that it was less than a year that she was there that her photographs were seen around the world.
Yeah, they started to get picked up by the AP, right?
Right.
So you said, she spends all this time in Vietnam. She takes all these photos. She gets an incredible amount of coverage because she does do extremely dangerous and risky things to get the shot, and is embedded with troops the entire time. So what makes the News Corps turn on her? It seems like that would be the kind of person they would want to continue having access to.
Well, almost immediately when she won a major award, news photography award, with pictures she took in her first a year or 18 months. And it was like as soon as she started succeeding, that's when people turned on her. People attributed a lot of her photographs to luck, which was insane. Pretty much everyone who knows anything about the press corps in Vietnam will agree that Catherine Leroy spent more time in the field, in combat, than anyone.
Yeah, and it seems like, okay, well, luck would happen once or twice.
Right.
Not continuously. That's how luck works.
Yeah,
luck is once in a lifetime.
Yeah.
It's not like she won for that one photo or whatever, that one set of photos, but her photos kept being published. So clearly she had done something that wasn't about luck.
Right. She wasn't the most technically skilled photographer, but she kind of, if you look at her pictures, her photographs, there are eyes in almost every one of them. I mean, some of them are like bombs or napalm dropping on the forest or whatever, but she got close to the soldiers. They were her age.
Yes.
She identified with them, and she got close to them, and she said, if I don't feel something, why take the picture?
Yeah. I thought it was interesting when she was talking about the camaraderie that she had with the soldiers, particularly as the war went on, and her perception of why the Americans were there started to shift, which you kind of touched on in the book, that, she was seeing a lot of violence. So I guess that closeness, I always kind of wondered if she was able to maintain, because she talked about objectivity versus subjectivity. At some point she lost a little bit of her objectivity because I think she didn't agree with what they were doing.
Yeah, I can't know really what was going on in her mind, but I think that at the point where you're involved in the middle of combat and you're taking a picture, there's really not going to be much objectivity. I mean, unless I can't imagine it. Her ideas about the war did change because she thought it was fine when she first went, and then she realized it wasn't. But you know what? A lot of the soldiers with her were realizing the same thing.
Yeah. It felt very much like, I actually thought that the book and her story did the same thing, which is that, like, you told the story of the Vietnam through what Katrine was experiencing, which I thought was a really smart move, because one of the things I had written in my notes to talk about was the fact that, like, our American education system simply does not teach about the Vietnam War. I remember when I was in high school, distinctly remember when we were in U.S. history, our teacher saying, we might get to the Vietnam War this year. And then we didn't. I think we watched, like, Forrest Gump. And that was our education about the Vietnam War. And so I learned more in your book about the Vietnam War than I have in 18 years of public education as a student.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I take that to heart because, to be honest, when I first decided to write this book and about Katrine, I had no intention of writing about the Vietnam War, and that's just how silly I was. I wanted to tell her story.
Right, but you can't tell her story if you don't tell the story of the war.
Believe me, I have learned way more about Vietnam that I'm glad I know.
Yes.
But that I don't think hardly any people know. I mean, it has to be a few, maybe, I don't know, a generation or two back in it before it really is history and you can talk about it in an objective manner. I don't know, but I had to do a lot of research on the Vietnam War, and it was extremely painful. And this book came back to me from my editor at least 6 times because it was very difficult to write about something as complex as the Vietnam War and to make it succinct enough to fit in this book.
Yeah, I think that that's a struggle. I mean, because your work, I mean, I teach, high school students every single day, and not a single one of them knows anything about the Vietnam War. And I don't. And that's the thing, is that, like, a lot of their teachers are my age or a little older, and they never got taught about the Vietnam War. And so it's just not something they prioritize teaching about. And as a young adult, I became really pissed off about the fact that I didn't know anything about Vietnam, because it seemed to me that that's what we were doing when I was 19, was entering into a war on a false premise and disrupting an entire country's ecosystem to enact our own political agenda. And we hadn't learned any lessons from it because we hadn't been taught them.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate your book because I think that, any amount of information on the Vietnam War that gets into the heads of youths is a good amount. And I think also to me, the book really read well as an adult too, because I don't know a lot. And I needed that. I needed a little brisk informational dump so I could understand even what was happening. I just know like basics of the Vietnam War.
Right. Yeah. I think probably most people.
I actually wanted to talk a little bit about something that you pointed out in the book. I really appreciated and admired that you frequently talked about some of the egregious missteps that the U.S. government and military made during the war. Right now, I'm going to make a little jump here. Right now, we're hearing a lot about state legislatures who are trying to do pushback on teaching critical race theory in schools. That is, teaching history with race in mind. And I think a lot of that pushback comes from a place of defensiveness in America, where we don't really want to take a look and examine the ways in which we participate in and allow violence and oppression to occur. And especially towards Black people, people of color, and other marginalized people. And I think that there's a similar problem when it comes to the Vietnam War. I think that's one of the reasons why we don't teach it, is because you would have to also take a look at how American soldiers, leaders, and et cetera, committed really gruesome acts of violence and perpetuated terrible racism, which you touch on a little bit in the book. And I thought it was interesting that you included some of those pictures, that moment when they're on that, she'd been on days and days of that long march with those soldiers who were clearly at that point irritated, and like irritated because it was pointless. They hadn't had any action, and it just seemed like they were going through the torture of the jungle.
And they had people killed.
Yeah, many. Hundreds, right? At that point?
Their lieutenant had been killed, and so they were in a very bad mood.
Yeah, they were in a very bad place. And I won't necessarily go into the specifics, but a moment happens where they find a quote-unquote enemy in a pond, and these soldiers take it upon themselves to be very violent. And Katrine was taking these photos as it was happening, and everybody's allowing the photos to be taken because they weren't even conscious, it seems, at that moment of how far they were taking it. And I was wondering a little bit about how you made the decision to include those photos in the book, and if you had any pushback in doing that.
I had no pushback, and I absolutely knew as soon as I saw the photos that they needed to be included. One of the things that I learned in the research for this book was that the military had a file on American atrocities. This file was not to investigate or bring any kind of change or justice. This file was so that they would have the facts if something got out in the media.
Yeah. So the atrocities were numerous.
I do want to say, I think this is a very touchy issue because there were some atrocities that were horrendous and people should have been punished. And there were a lot of soldiers in Vietnam who did not commit any atrocities. But they were trained from the very beginning to look at the Vietnamese, Vietnamese enemy as inhuman. From the very first day they went into basic training, they were told, call them this name.
Yeah,
they're
racist
not
epithets.
human. And they were basically brainwashed. So I think it's absolutely horrendous, the atrocities that happened. And I also think that as a nation, as a people, we need to think about what we're doing when we take an 18-year-old boy and send him into a situation like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the pitfalls of not teaching about the Vietnam War is we don't learn the lessons from it.
Right.
You know, it is a situation that happened, and terrible things happened on many levels, but we don't talk about it enough to learn from it in order to...
Well, look at this. I mean, the whole pictures from Iraq, the torture pictures.
Abu Ghraib.
And then, yes, and then the debate that was still going on about whether torture
was acceptable. Yeah. And it seems like we're just still not ever really talking about it in a way that is meaningful and would enact any change. So that to me is one of those lessons, to circle back to what we talked about at the beginning, where we are learning that we never learned. So one of my last questions for you is, I wonder if there were any parts of Katrine's story that you had to leave out of your book.
I had to leave out the smoking. I was not allowed to put in the smoking and the drinking.
Also, she swore like a sailor, right?
Yeah, and they made, yes, and they okay, so this, I'm just going to say my piece here. I'm writing a book about bodies getting blown away.
Yeah.
And I am not allowed to use some bad words.
That's wild.
I mean, it's not, my editor doesn't necessarily agree with that, but he said the libraries will not buy them if they have cuss words in them. And if you look at the banned books list, you will see that in many libraries across the country, a cuss word is enough to get the book taken out.
Yeah. That would wipe out half of my collection. If that were the metric
Sounds
that
like
we were
you have
using.
a great collection.
I absolutely do. You know how I know? Because I have raised circulation statistics by 180%.
Wow. Congratulations.
I know, because I'm putting in books that people want to read. Imagine that. And they happen to contain language of material that is realistic to what teens are saying and doing.
Right.
And, that's just how it is. And I think everybody has the right to make an individual choice of what they're okay with and not okay with. But they don't have that right to extend it upon everyone else. But I understand why a publisher would be like, I want you to sell books. You're going to sell books if you don't put in these words. In other books, I've just taken them out completely. In this book, in some cases, if they're direct quotes, I was able to keep them in by just taking out some of the letters. Yeah, she said the F word a lot, right?
She said all the words a lot.
She's great. I know you haven't listened much to our show, but if you have listened to any of it, we swear.
Yes, I
frequently,
do know that.
loudly, and proudly. Because it's part of who we are. That's, that was actually a feedback we got during our first season. Was I like your show. I just wish you wouldn't swear so much. And I was like, well, that's too fucking bad. Just because that's just not who we are.
Not your audience.
And it's like, if that's a thing that stops you from listening, then okay, that's cool for you. But like, we're not going to change who we are. As when I go to work, do I swear at work? No, because that's my job. And I expect the students to also change their speech patterns to come to school, right? It's kind of like I'm modeling the behavior I want them to do. But I let them know frequently and often that this isn't how I talk when I'm at home. It's not how I talk when I'm with my friends. And I do that in order to like reinforce to them that like I have to change my behavior when I'm at school because that's what's acceptable and that's what our norm is. When I'm outside of school, I get to do whatever the hell I want. I get to talk like how I want.
Right.
And I think that has, helped us maintain an authenticity on our show. And I want to say that I think that that's what made Katrine feel like an authentic person, was knowing that she learned English from American soldiers who swore a lot. So her vocabulary was very rich.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, I have a couple other questions for you. What's next for you? Are you researching anyone right now that you're working on after Katrine's story?
I have a couple ideas, but at this point, they're just ideas. I'm currently most immersed in a novel that I'm writing.
Ooh, a novel.
Right. I had a novel published almost 20 years ago, and I have always wanted to write fiction, but once I got going on these women, I kind of got on a train that wouldn't stop.
And so now you're writing a novel. What's that like for you, writing fiction?
I love it. I absolutely love it. It's very hard because I've always been I was a broadcast journalist, and I wrote for a newspaper, and then I wrote about these nonfiction. I wrote all these true stories about women, and writing a novel is very different, and I've had to educate myself a lot and work very hard. I've written, I won't tell you how many novels that never really, got to any point where they were good enough to be published.
Yes, same. I guess I'll just keep toiling away at it.
Yeah, that's all you can do.
Is it for adults or young adults?
It's for young adults.
Awesome.
I'm putting a few swear words in.
You can put a lot of stuff in there. I don't think I've read a YA book that didn't have some kind of sex scene in it for a long time. So where can people find you if they want to look you up and read your stuff and see your social media? Where can they find you?
Well, my website is my name, Mary Cronk Farrell. That's CRONK F as in Frank, ARRELL.com. And on my website is my email and all my social media, and I'm very easy to get in touch with.
So I want to just thank you again for coming in and talking with us today about your books and in our humble home studio to talk about women's history and your books and so much more. I want to remind our listeners that you can pick up Mary Cronk Farrell's books at your local independent bookstore, please. Please. If you're here in Spokane, that's the Wishing Tree Books and Aunties and Giant Nerd Books. We've got some great ones here. If you're elsewhere, buy it from your local store. Please don't buy it from Amazon. Please don't buy it from Amazon. But if you're gonna buy it. I'd rather have you buy it than not buy it. But her newest book, which is called Close Up on War, the story of pioneering photojournalist Katrine Leroy in Vietnam, will be out in February 2022, but you can pre-order it now.
Yes, it is available for pre-order now.
Yeah, so put it on your lists. If you're a librarian, put it on your list. I read it and it's great.
Okay, so can I make a little offer here?
Sure.
Okay, so I've been thinking about trying to reward people who pre-order the book. And this is a wonderful book for book groups, both for teens and adults. And so maybe if anyone hears about it on this show and they pre-order the book, I would do a visit, a Skype or Zoom visit to their book club.
All right. So there you go, listeners. If you decide you want to do a book club on Mary Cronk Farrell's newest book as it comes out in February, you can pre-order it now. And we can have like an IDK Her book club. Yes. So let us know on Instagram if that's something you're going to do, or email us or catch us on Facebook, as you all know. We are at IDK Her Podcast. We'd like to thank our editor, Lucas McIntyre, for his work on our episode today and all other episodes. And we also want to thank our fucking wonderful Jennifer Finch for our theme music, who has generously provided it for us. And also our listeners for staying with us. And make sure, if you haven't done so already, you check us out on Patreon and subscribe. Buy our merch on TeePublic. And thank you for listening. And thank you, Mary, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really enjoyable conversation.
Awesome. We will talk to you all later. Goodbye.
Bye.